December 13th, 1937. The gates of Nanjing break open. Captain Gunkichi Tanaka walks into the city carrying a single sword. By the time he walks out 6 weeks later, that sword has a name, a reputation, and a body count that even his own commanders quietly stopped writing down. His fellow officers called him fearless. The people inside those walls called him something else. And on a cold January morning in 1948, the same hands that once gripped that blade are tied behind his back as he is forced to kneel in the dirt at Yuhuatai, the execution ground on the southern edge of the city he helped destroy. How does a captain, one officer out of thousands, become so deeply connected to one of the worst atrocities of the entire 20th century? What did he do inside Nanjing that made his name impossible to erase from the record? And what happened in that prison cell the morning they finally came for him? Gunkichi Tanaka was born in Japan in the early 1900s, during a time when the empire was racing to prove itself to the world. Military academies were producing a new generation of officers trained on one simple idea from the day they walked through the gates. Loyalty to the emperor was everything. Mercy was weakness. Surrender was shame. Tanaka absorbed every word of it. He entered the Imperial Japanese Army as a young man and climbed steadily through the ranks. By the mid-1930s, he was a captain, a company commander, a man trusted to lead troops in the field. To his superiors, he was disciplined and aggressive. To the soldiers under him, he was harder than that. A commander who believed the more you pushed men, the sharper they became. He pushed hard. He was assigned to the 6th Division under Lieutenant General Hisao Tani, the same unit that would later become one of the most notorious formations in modern military history. In the summer of 1937, when full war broke out between Japan and China, Tanaka and the 6th Division crossed the sea to fight. None of them knew that within a few months their names would be attached to something the world would never forget. But Tanaka would not just be part of it. He would become a face of it. The Japanese advance from Shanghai to Nanjing was brutal, fast, and almost impossible to stop. Chinese forces were outgunned and exhausted. City after city fell. Along that road, discipline inside many Japanese units began to collapse. Officers looked the other way. Soldiers were told the enemy was not human. Iron captains like Tanaka were given enormous freedom to operate however they wanted. It was during this advance that Japanese newspapers back home began printing something that told the whole story of what was happening to this army. Two young officers, Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were reportedly racing each other to see who could kill 100 people, first using only a sword. The Japanese press ran it like a sports score. Numbers were updated, photos were printed. The public read it the way modern audiences follow celebrity news. It was a window into how completely the value of human life had collapsed inside the invading force. Tanaka was not one of those two lieutenants, but he was moving down the same blood-soaked road with the same mindset, carrying his own sword, a blade he reportedly named and treated almost like a personal weapon he had bonded with. While Mukai and Noda were chasing headlines, Tanaka was quietly building a record that would eventually be worse than both of theirs combined. And he had no idea that record was already being collected. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe now and hit the bell. Don't let history bury them a second time. Nanjing fell on December 13th, 1937. What followed over the next 6 weeks is now remembered as one of the most catastrophic events of the entire Second World War. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers had surrendered. Civilians were trapped inside the city. A small group of foreign residents had set up a safety zone and were trying desperately to protect as many people as they could. But the violence outside those walls was beyond anything they had ever witnessed. In the middle of all of it stood Captain Gunkichi Tanaka. According to records later compiled by the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, Tanaka personally took part in the mass killing of unarmed prisoners and civilians inside the city. The number attached to his name is one historians still find difficult to say out loud. More than 300 people. Not in battle, not in self-defense. killed by a single officer who had decided the rules of war did not apply to him. Survivor testimony, captured Japanese documents, and post-war investigations all pointed to the same pattern. Tanaka was not a soldier swept up in chaos. He was an officer who made the choice to participate repeatedly, deliberately, over an extended period of time. And here is the part that stops every honest historian cold. While all of this was happening, Tanaka was not hiding. He was not ashamed. In the climate of the Imperial Army at that moment, he was treated as exactly the kind of officer the Empire wanted. He went back to his tent. He ate his meals, he gave orders the next morning. Then he did it all over again. But every empire eventually loses. Japan surrendered in September 1945. Within weeks, Allied investigators began the enormous task of identifying the officers responsible for war crimes across Asia. The Nanjing case was at the very top of that list. Chinese authorities, working with American forces, demanded that the men connected to the massacre be found, arrested, and handed over for trial. Gunkichi Tanaka was one of the first names on the list. By 1947, American troops in occupied Japan had located him and placed him under arrest inside Sugamo prison in Tokyo, the same facility processing many of the most dangerous figures from the imperial regime. From there, Tanaka was transported by sea to China and delivered to Nanjing, the very city where his crimes had taken place. For Tanaka, this moment had to have felt like the world collapsing in on itself. He was no longer a captain. He was no longer protected by an empire. He was a prisoner being walked through streets where survivors of the massacre still lived, still remembered, and still carried what he had helped create. He was placed on trial alongside the two lieutenants, Mukai and Noda, the same men whose killing competition had once been printed in Japanese newspapers like a game score. The three of them now sat in the same courtroom, facing the same judges, accused of the same category of crimes. The evidence against Tanaka was overwhelming. Wartime Japanese records, witness statements, captured photographs, survivor testimony, all of it pointing in one direction. The tribunal found that his actions during the fall of Nanjing were not the mistakes of a soldier caught up in chaos. They were the deliberate, repeated decisions of an officer who used his rank and his sword to kill people who posed no threat to him or anyone else. The verdict surprised no one. Guilty of war crimes. Guilty of crimes against humanity. Sentenced to death. There was no long appeal, no diplomatic rescue, no backdoor deal. The empire that had once stood behind men like Tanaka no longer existed. The flag he had served had been folded away. The orders he had followed were now evidence of a sickness that had nearly destroyed an entire continent. He was alone in a Chinese prison cell, waiting. That wait ended in late January 1948. On the morning of January 28, 1948, Tanaka was taken from his cell alongside Mukai and Noda. The three men were transported under guard to Yuhuatai, the hill on the southern edge of Nanjing chosen specifically as the execution ground. Yuhuatai was not a random location. It was a place connected to centuries of Chinese memory and sacrifice. Choosing it for this execution was not an accident. It was a message. A photograph from that morning still survives. It shows the three condemned officers sitting together, smoking their final cigarettes. Their faces stripped of every trace of the arrogance they had once carried into China. So when the moment finally came to walk them to the execution spot, the men who had once moved through Nanjing like they were untouchable could barely stand. The strength they had performed for years was gone. They had to be guided, supported, almost carried the final distance. The execution was carried out by firing squad, fast, official, final. Tanaka was 42 years old. Mukai and Noda were both 35. Within seconds, the three names that had haunted the survivors of Nanjing for more than a decade were gone. Their bodies were taken away quietly. Historians believe they were buried in unmarked locations, to make certain no future visitor could ever turn the spot into a shrine. Tanaka was not a famous general. He was not a household name. He was a captain, one officer out of thousands in the Imperial Japanese Army. But his story is the one that exposes how this kind of killing actually happens, not from the top down in some grand strategy, but from the middle out. From captains who decided the rules did not apply to them. From commanders who looked the other way, from a press that turned murder into entertainment and called it news. The sword he carried into Nanjing is long gone, but the record of what he did with it is still there, carved into tribunal documents, survivor testimony, and the memorial wall in the city he destroyed. The empire that trained him, armed him, and turned him loose inside those gates collapsed in 1945. He lasted 3 years after it. In the end, the man who had spent years acting like death itself had finally met it. In the same city, in the same dirt, and in front of the same people he had once believed he could erase from the world. He was wrong about all of it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next officer we cover from the Nanjing trials had an even darker record than Tanaka, and his final morning is waiting for you in the next video.